Husband took all my money and fled with his mistress. What she was hiding was, you won't believe what I just uncovered. My husband, the man I trusted with everything, had been stealing millions from innocent people, and I had no idea. You're probably thinking, how could someone be so blind? Well, here's the twist. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the lies, the manipulation, and the people pulling the strings behind the scenes. How far would you go to uncover the truth? Stick with me, because the truth isn't just going to surprise you. It's going to change everything you thought you knew about trust and betrayal. Let's get into it. I never imagined my life would spiral into something straight out of a high-stakes thriller. But there I was, sitting in my car, parked outside the bustling international terminal at LAX. My laptop open, streaming live security feeds. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I read the message glowing on my phone screen. Flying to Paris with my lover. Enjoy your broke life, sweetheart. My heart should have clenched. My stomach should have dropped. Instead, a slow, bitter smile curled on my lips. If only he knew. The man who sent that message, my husband, Logan Carter, was arrogant enough to believe he'd won. He thought he was slipping away with a fortune, leaving me in financial ruin while he jetted off to Europe with his so-called mistress. But what he didn't know was that I had been watching him, tracking his every move, setting him up for his own downfall. I let out a slow breath and glanced at the departure board inside the terminal through my windshield. Flight 207 to Paris delayed. Perfect. Just as planned. The past 6 months had been leading to this very moment. I used to be blissfully unaware, living under the illusion that my marriage was built on trust, partnership, love. God, I had been such a fool. Logan had always been the charming one, the kind of man who could walk into a room and have people eating out of the palm of his hand within minutes. He had that easy confidence, that boyish smirk that made you want to believe him. I had, for years. I thought we were a team. I thought the late nights at the office, the business trips, the sudden obsession with optimizing our finances were just the necessary evils of a high-powered finance career. I ignored the red flags. The way his phone was always turned face down, the sudden, secretive nature of his work, the overly passionate declarations of love that started feeling more like performances than genuine moments of affection. Then, 6 months ago, the cracks began to show. A missing $50,000 from our joint savings was the first breadcrumb. When I confronted him, he laughed, brushed it off. Babe, it's an investment. It'll double in no time. That was when I knew. The Logan I married never made stupid financial moves, not unless he had something to hide. I stopped asking questions and started digging. And what I found? It shattered everything. Logan wasn't just playing with our money, he was playing with millions. Embezzlement, offshore accounts, fraudulent shell companies. He had been stealing from Baldwin and Whitaker, the very firm he had sworn was his pride and joy. I should have been angry. I should have screamed at him, demanded answers. Instead, I did something smarter. I stayed silent. I let him think he had me fooled. And then I went to the FBI. That's when I met Agent Marcus Reed, a man who had been trying to nail Baldwin and Whitaker's corruption for years. But he lacked one thing: proof. That's where I came in. I had access to Logan's files, his accounts, his movements. All I had to do was keep playing the role of the clueless wife, while quietly feeding the FBI everything they needed to take him down. And then, a week ago, Logan made his final move. He drained what he thought were our last savings accounts, packed his bags, and booked a one-way ticket to Paris with a woman he thought was his lover. The irony? She wasn't a lover at all. She was an undercover FBI agent named Mia Dawson, assigned to lure him into a false sense of security. Now, as I sat in my car, watching the feeds from inside the terminal, I could see Logan walking toward the security checkpoint. He looked so damn confident, strolling through the airport like he had just pulled off the heist of the century. He had no idea that every step he took was being monitored. No idea that his accounts had been frozen the moment he tried to access them. No idea that the private jet he had planned for an alternative escape had been seized hours ago. My phone buzzed. A new text. B2, I took a little extra from your emergency fund. Consider it payment for 5 years of pretending to love you. I swallowed down the sudden burning rage that rose in my throat. I knew he was a liar. I knew he was a thief. But the casual cruelty of that text still stung. I thought about the man I had married, the one who had once brought me soup when I was sick, the one who had held my hand at my mother's funeral, the one who had whispered promises of forever against my skin. Had any of it been real? Had I just been a stepping stone in his grand plan all along? But then, just as quickly as the hurt came, it was gone, replaced by something else, something colder. Logan thought he had played me. But he was about to learn the hard way. I had never been the fool he believed me to be. I lifted my phone and typed a response. Maybe you should talk to the police officer behind you first. Through the security feed on my laptop, I watched Logan's face shift from smug satisfaction to pure, unfiltered panic. He spun around, eyes darting, breath hitching in his throat. There was no officer yet, but his reaction told me everything I needed to know. He was guilty. And he knew he was caught. I took a deep breath and let the moment settle in. This was it, the beginning of his end. Logan had spent years thinking he was the smartest person in the room. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. I used to believe that when love died, it went quietly, like a candle flickering out. But that was a lie. Love, when betrayed, didn't fade, it roared, it clawed, it screamed for justice. And that's exactly what had kept me going these past few months. I had spent years believing in Logan, in the life we had built together, in the whispered promises and shared dreams. But the man I married wasn't real. He was a fabrication, a beautifully crafted illusion designed to lure me in, to make me trust him, to make me an accomplice in his perfect crime without even realizing it. But I had realized it, and I had played the long game. Sitting in my car outside LAX, watching Logan unravel on the security feed, I felt a sharp sense of satisfaction settle in my chest. He had just read my text, the one that hinted at the police officer standing behind him. The officer wasn't actually there yet, but Logan didn't know that. The way his body stiffened, the way his head snapped around, the flicker of raw panic in his eyes, he was already spiraling. He deserved worse. The past 6 months had been a slow, methodical descent into the truth, each discovery more horrifying than the last. It had started with that missing $50,000, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. Logan hadn't just dipped into our savings, he had spent years orchestrating a massive embezzlement scheme through Baldwin and Whitaker. Millions of dollars funneled through offshore accounts, shell companies, and fraudulent investments. He was stealing from people who had trusted him, who had built their futures around his promises. And while he had played the part of the devoted husband, he had been meticulously planning his escape, ensuring that by the time I realized what had happened, he would be long gone. What he hadn't accounted for was me. I had spent years working as a forensic accountant. Numbers had always spoken to me in ways that words never could. I could see patterns where others saw chaos, could spot discrepancies buried beneath layers of carefully structured deception. And once I started looking into Logan's financial records, it didn't take long to uncover the truth. But instead of confronting him, I did something he never would have expected. I let him keep going. I let him believe he had fooled me. I let him continue weaving his tangled web, all while I was quietly unraveling it behind his back. That was when I met Agent Marcus Reed. The FBI had been circling Baldwin and Whitaker for months, suspecting that something was off but lacking the concrete evidence to bring them down. I had that evidence. I had the transaction records, the offshore account numbers, the internal communications that pointed directly to Logan as the mastermind. Marcus had listened carefully as I laid it all out, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp. Then, after a long pause, he had leaned forward and said, "We don't just want Logan. We want everyone involved. You willing to help us get them?" I didn't even hesitate. And so the plan had been set into motion. The FBI had created fake accounts, letting Logan think he was transferring stolen funds into real offshore holdings. Every dollar he believed he was siphoning away was being tracked, documented, and tied directly back to him. Then came the final piece, Mia Dawson. She was the bait, the perfect mark, the woman Logan thought he had seduced into running away with him. I watched now as Mia, still playing the role of Logan's doting mistress, leaned in, brushing her hand against his arm, whispering something in his ear. I wondered if he could hear the tension in her voice, if he could feel the way her body had subtly shifted, her posture rigid. Probably not. Logan had always been good at reading people, but only when it served him. He had spent years underestimating me, after all. My phone buzzed. A new message from Marcus. He's heading for the checkpoint. He's carrying something, could be a backup drive. I swallowed hard. Logan was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He had to know that if things went south, he'd need leverage. A fail-safe. And if he had copies of those fraudulent transactions, there was no telling what kind of deal he might try to cut. My stomach twisted at the thought. I clicked over to a different security feed, zooming in on Logan's hands. And that's when I saw it. The briefcase. My father's briefcase. My chest tightened, my breath catching in my throat. That briefcase had belonged to my dad, Richard Hayes, a man who had spent his life building a reputation of integrity in the financial sector. After he passed, it had been one of the few things I had left of him, a symbol of everything he had stood for. And now Logan was clutching it like it was his lifeline, using it to smuggle out the evidence of his crimes. Anger surged through me, white-hot and blinding. I pressed my earpiece. Marcus, he's got my father's briefcase. That's where he's keeping whatever he's carrying. Do not let him walk out of this airport with it. Copy that. Marcus's voice crackled through the line. Logan was moving faster now, his steps purposeful, his shoulders tight with barely contained urgency. He was getting nervous. He knew something wasn't right. And then, as if the universe had decided to drive the final nail into his coffin, my phone buzzed with one more message. It wasn't from Marcus. It wasn't from Mia. It was from Logan. Nice try, Isabel. But I hope you're ready, because if I go down, I'm taking you with me. A chill ran down my spine. He was bluffing. He had to be. But before I could even process the thought, another message came through. Check your email. Let's see how much you really knew about dear old Dad. My blood turned to ice. I hesitated, my hands trembling as I clicked into my inbox. And there it was, a folder labeled Richard Hayes, Project Files. I clicked it open, my vision blurring as I scanned the contents. Financial statements, offshore accounts, internal memos, transactions dating back 15 years. The exact same kind of fraud Logan had been orchestrating. Only this time, the documents were tied to my father's name. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear myself think. No, this wasn't possible. My father wasn't, he couldn't be. But as I scrolled further, the weight of it hit me like a freight train. The fraud at Baldwin and Whitaker hadn't started with Logan. It had started with my father. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Logan had known. He had known all along. That's why he had married me. That's why he had pushed so hard to work at Baldwin and Whitaker. He had been playing me from the start. My father was part of this. And now, Logan was using that truth as his final weapon. I knew something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it until I found it. But here's the shocking part. After all the evidence was right in front of me, what did I find out about my own father's role in all of this? Was he just a victim too? Or was he part of the scam all along? You're going to want to hear this, trust me. Comment below, do you think my father was guilty or just caught up in it all? 1 for guilty, 2 for innocent. Let's see if you can guess what happens next. The air inside my car felt suffocating, the weight of Logan's last message pressing down on my chest like a boulder. My father, the man who had raised me, who had taught me right from wrong, who had instilled in me the very sense of justice that led me to uncover Logan's crimes. Was he really part of it? My fingers hovered over the trackpad, my mind screaming at me to close the folder, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But I couldn't. I had spent months chasing the truth, believing that I was the one in control, that I was the one setting the trap. And now Logan had flipped the game board over. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting to pull me under with him, to drag me down into the same pit of corruption he had thrived in. My pulse hammered against my temples as I scrolled through the files. At first it looked damning. Offshore accounts linked to my father's name. Transaction records buried under layers of shell companies. Internal memos from Baldwin and Whitaker going back over a decade. The very same kind of fraud Logan had committed. Only this had started long before he had even set foot in the company. My stomach twisted into knots as I scanned the numbers, my trained eye automatically tracing the patterns. It all looked so deliberate, so calculated. But then something caught my attention, a memo from 15 years ago, one that had been forwarded multiple times, landing in my father's inbox. The subject line was simple: adjustment required. I clicked it open, my breath catching as I read the contents. We need these discrepancies adjusted before the next audit. The board has approved the movement of funds. Do not escalate. I scrolled down. The sender wasn't my father. It was someone higher up, someone giving him an order, a direct command to manipulate the numbers. My hands trembled as I went back to the transaction records, looking at them through a new lens. And that's when it hit me. My father wasn't orchestrating this. He was covering it up, or worse, he was being forced to. My vision blurred as memories flooded back, fragments of conversations I had overheard as a teenager, moments that hadn't made sense back then, but were suddenly horrifyingly clear. The late nights at his office, the stress that seemed to eat away at him year after year, the way he had tried to warn me subtly, cautiously about the kind of people who ran companies like Baldwin and Whitaker. I could still hear his voice. Numbers don't lie, Isabel, but people do. He had known. He had known the whole time. And instead of running, instead of exposing them, he had stayed. Why? Had he been afraid? Had they threatened him? Or worse, had they given him no choice? My hands clenched into fists. Logan thought he had won. He thought this would break me. But what he didn't realize was that he had just given me something far more powerful than blackmail. He had given me the missing piece of the puzzle. If Baldwin and Whitaker had been running this scheme for over a decade, that meant there were more people involved. Bigger players. People who had built their wealth off this corruption. Who had orchestrated every cover-up, every strategic adjustment. Logan wasn't the mastermind, he was just a parasite who had latched onto a rotting system and sucked it dry. I inhaled sharply, forcing the pieces into place. Logan had planned his escape perfectly, but he had underestimated the scale of his own crime. He thought he could take the money and disappear. He thought Baldwin and Whitaker would take the fall, that he would slip through the cracks, untraceable, untouchable. But what he hadn't counted on was the fact that the people who had built this empire would not let him walk away so easily. I needed to move fast. I hit the call button, my fingers tightening around my phone as Marcus picked up. "Tell me you got something," he said, his voice tense. "Oh, I got something," I exhaled. And Logan just gave me a hell of a lot more. I forwarded him the files, my hands barely steady enough to type out the email. There wasn't time to process what this meant for my father, for his legacy, for the version of him I had held on to for so long. That reckoning would come later. Right now, I had one goal, taking Logan down before he could do any more damage. "What's the play?" I asked, my voice harder than I expected. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "You're not gonna like it." I knew what that meant. I closed my eyes, bracing myself. "Go ahead." "We let him board the plane." I sat up straight. "Are you out of your mind?" "If we take him now, we only get him on embezzlement and fraud," Marcus explained. "But if we let him believe he's in the clear, If we let him make contact with whoever is waiting for him in Paris, we get everyone. We trace his next move, follow the money, track the players. And when we bring him in, we don't just get Logan, we get the entire operation. I pressed my fingers against my temples, my brain screaming at me to say no, to shut this down, to stop him before he could slip any further away. But Marcus was right. This wasn't just about Logan anymore. This was about every person he had worked for, every name hidden behind those transactions, every shadowy figure who had profited from the destruction of innocent lives. And if letting him board that plane was the only way to get them all, then so be it. I opened my eyes, my pulse steadying. Fine, I said. But the second he steps off that plane, Marcus didn't hesitate. We'll be waiting. I ended the call and stared at the security feed, watching Logan as he passed through the checkpoint, the briefcase still clutched in his grip, his eyes darting around like a man who was waiting for the ground to collapse beneath him. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. Not yet. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my mind racing faster than my pulse. Letting Logan board that plane went against every instinct I had. Every cell in my body screamed at me to storm into that terminal, to rip the briefcase from his hands, to watch as he was dragged away in handcuffs, his carefully orchestrated escape crumbling into nothing. But Marcus was right, taking him now would only get us a fraction of the truth. If we wanted to dismantle the entire web of corruption at Baldwin and Whitaker, we had to let him go just a little further. Let him think he had won. Let him lead us straight to the bigger players. I forced myself to focus on the security feed, watching Logan as he made his way through the checkpoint. His posture was tense, his fingers tightening around the briefcase, his eyes darting in every direction. He was nervous, but he still thought he had control. He still thought he had an edge, that his ace in the hole, my father's so-called involvement, would keep me from going through with this. He thought he could manipulate me, twist my emotions, make me hesitate just long enough for him to slip away. I exhaled sharply and reached for my phone, pulling up my father's files again. The truth was a jagged thing cutting into me from all angles. There was no denying that his name was all over those documents, no denying that he had been involved, but the more I dug, the clearer the picture became. He hadn't been the architect of the scheme, he had been trapped in it, forced to play a role he hadn't wanted. And Logan, the arrogant bastard, had known the entire time. That's why he had married me. That's why he had pushed so hard to climb the ranks at Baldwin and Whitaker. He had used me, not just for access, but as his personal insurance policy. If things ever went south, he had dirt on my father to ensure that I wouldn't turn against him. I clenched my jaw, bile rising in my throat. He had played a long game, but he had underestimated me. He had counted on my love for my father to keep me in check, to make me doubt myself, to stop me from taking him down. But what he had failed to understand was that I wasn't just my father's daughter, I was his legacy. And if my father had spent his last years buried under the weight of secrets and lies, then I would be the one to set things right. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. Marcus, he's through security. Next stop, the gate. You ready? I swallowed the lump in my throat and typed back. Me, ready. But I wasn't. Not really. Because for all my planning, for all the calculated steps that had led me to this moment, nothing could prepare me for what came next. I started my car and pulled out of my parking spot, merging onto the road that led away from the airport. If Logan was leaving, so was I. But while he was heading to Paris, one had a different destination, Baldwin and Whitaker. I had spent months tearing apart Logan's schemes, but now it was time to go straight to the source. If this company had been corrupt for over a decade, then there were people still inside pulling the strings. And while the FBI could handle the legal side of things, I needed answers I could only get from the people who had known my father. The drive to downtown Los Angeles felt like a blur, my mind playing over every interaction I had ever had with Baldwin and Whitaker's executives. The men who had smiled at me at holiday parties, the colleagues who had patted my father on the back for a job well done. Had they known? Had they watched him struggle, knowing that they had forced him into a cage he could never escape from? By the time I pulled into the underground parking lot of the Baldwin and Whitaker building, my hands were steady, my breath even. I had spent my entire life seeing numbers as black and white, but this was something else entirely. This was about people. I stepped out of the car and took the elevator to the 32nd floor, my father's old floor. It wasn't his office anymore. It hadn't been for years, but the people who had worked alongside him were still there. And if they had been a part of this, they were about to realize that the days of hiding behind spreadsheets and boardroom deals were over. The receptionist barely looked up as I walked past her, my heels clicking against the marble floor. My destination was clear: Harold Kingston's office. The man who had once been my father's mentor. The man who had given him his start at the firm. The man who, according to the files Logan had sent me, had also been the one to send that email. The one that had instructed my father to adjust the discrepancies. I didn't bother knocking. Harold looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from mild surprise to something colder, something calculative. "Isabel," he said smoothly, setting down his pen. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I tossed a folder onto his desk. "You tell me." He opened it, his gaze flicking over the documents before his jaw tightened ever so slightly. A flicker of irritation. Not fear, he was too experienced for that, but something close. He leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was a chess piece he hadn't accounted for. "These are sensitive documents," he said finally. "Where did you get them?" I crossed my arms. "From the man you thought you could trust, Logan Carter." That got a reaction, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a shift in his posture. He knew exactly who Logan was. "Ah," he said, nodding slowly. "So that's how this is going to go." I stepped closer, planting my hands on his desk, meeting his gaze with a steeliness that I hadn't even known I possessed until this moment. "Here's how this is going to go, Harold. You're going to tell me exactly what role my father played in all of this. You're going to tell me who was really pulling the strings. And you're going to do it now," his lips curled into a smirk. "And if I don't?" I smiled back, but there was no warmth in it. "Then I make sure you go down with Logan." He studied me for a long moment, then exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You really are your father's daughter." I didn't flinch. Damn right I am. And I was about to finish what he had started. I could feel the walls closing in as I stood in Harold Kingston's office, staring him down. The same man who had been a mentor to my father, the man who had watched him spiral, slowly suffocating under the weight of secrets and lies. I wasn't just here for answers anymore. I was here to expose everything. The smooth, calculated words I had prepared in my head suddenly seemed hollow, replaced by the raw intensity of what was at stake. Harold still hadn't said a word since I laid the documents on his desk. He hadn't moved either, his eyes scanning the pages, but I could see the tension creeping into his shoulders. He thought he had control, but I was done letting these men pull the strings. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice controlled, but his hands betraying him as they clenched around the edges of the papers. "Does it really matter?" I asked, leaning in slightly. I wasn't here to play nice. "You know exactly where I got them, and you know exactly what they mean." He let out a breath through his nose, like he was calculating his next move. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out how far I was willing to push. The thing was, he didn't know me as well as he thought he did. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, Isabel," Harold said finally, his voice dropping into a more serious tone. "This isn't a game. You can't just waltz in here, wave around these papers, and think it'll end well for you." I stared at him, and for the first time, I saw the man who had been behind my father's downfall, the man who had used him, manipulated him, and had no intention of letting him off the hook. That smirk, that smile that had once seemed friendly, now felt like a mask hiding something much darker. "I'm not playing a game, Harold," I said coldly. I'm here to finish what my father started. And I'm not leaving until you tell me everything. His eyes narrowed. And what makes you think I'm going to tell you anything? I took a step closer, my eyes never leaving his. Because if you don't, I'm making sure you take the fall with Logan. You really think you're going to walk away from this? That you can bury it all under layers of corporate bullshit and keep running your precious firm? For a moment, he didn't respond. His jaw tightened, and I could see his brain scrambling, looking for a way to get out of this without implicating himself. He wasn't used to being cornered. He wasn't used to people not buying his charm. Do you think you're the first person to walk in here with something like this? He sneered. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, Isabel. You don't scare me. Something in his voice, that arrogance, made my blood run cold. This man wasn't just a part of the problem, he was the one pulling the strings. The one who had kept everything hidden for years, making sure the corruption remained in the shadows, far beyond the reach of anyone who might try to expose it. And now here I was, sitting across from him, calling him out on everything. I wasn't sure if I was scared or exhilarated, but I knew one thing for sure. You should be scared, I said, my voice calm, my eyes locked on his. Because I'm not leaving until you talk. And if you think you can brush me off, I'll make sure your name is just as dirty as Logan's. I've got enough on you to take down this entire company, Harold. I'm not playing anymore. I let that hang in the air for a long moment. His smirk faltered just a fraction, and that was all I needed. The man who thought he could control everything was slipping, just a little. He wasn't used to being questioned. He wasn't used to someone fighting back. Fine, he muttered, his voice low. He set the papers down and leaned back in his chair, looking like he had just decided to let me in on some big secret. You want the truth? Here it is. I held my breath, not daring to move. My father wasn't a saint, he said, his voice turning darker. But he wasn't the mastermind. Not like you think. The plan came from the top, the real top. Your father was just the one who could make it happen. They knew they could use him, get him to play along with their scheme. And when they had him, they had you too. You were just a pawn in their game. My stomach twisted. Everything I had believed about my father, everything I thought I knew about him, was suddenly crumbling around me. I had always seen him as the victim forced into a corner, coerced into doing something he never wanted to do. But Harold was telling me something else, something far worse, that my father had been complicit. He had been part of the plan, whether he wanted to be or not. How could you? I breathed, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. How could you do this to him? To me? Harold just stared at me, his cold eyes never leaving mine. It was never about you, Isabel. It was about power. Money. You think people like us give a damn about your father's morals? He was weak, and they knew it. They promised him something better, something he couldn't turn down. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. All this time, I had been clinging to the idea that my father had been forced into this, that he had been a good man caught in a bad situation. But now I wasn't so sure. Was he just another pawn? Another man who had allowed himself to be seduced by the promise of wealth and status? I looked at Harold, seeing him for the first time as he truly was. He wasn't the mentor I had once thought he was. He was just another part of the system that had ruined everything I held dear. Where is it, Harold? I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Where's the rest of it? The accounts? The names? I want it all. Now. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he slid open the drawer of his desk and pulled out a flash drive. This is everything, he said, his voice a low whisper. It's all in there. Every transaction, every name, every move we made to cover our tracks. I took the flash drive from him, my fingers barely touching his. I didn't need to say anything. He knew. This was just the beginning. The weight of the flash drive in my hand felt heavier than any physical object should. It wasn't just a piece of technology anymore. It was everything. It was the map to everything Logan and his crooked associates had built. Every shady transaction, every deal that had turned people's lives upside down, and every lie they had fed me for years. As I stood there in Harold Kingston's office, staring at the flash drive like it was a ticking bomb, I felt my pulse quicken. I had it. I had the proof. But now what? What was I supposed to do with it? Harold leaned back in his chair, his smug expression barely hiding his growing anxiety. He hadn't expected me to actually get the information out of him not like this. He thought he was in control, but the tables had turned. I wasn't some naive girl who believed in the fairy tale anymore. I had seen the ugly truth, and now I was going to use it to tear their world apart. You think you can just walk out of here with that, Isabel? Harold's voice cut through the silence, his words sharp, but there was a hint of desperation underneath. He was unraveling, and it felt damn good to watch. You think this is going to end well for you? I tightened my grip on the drive, the plastic casing feeling like the only thing holding me together at this point. You've already made sure it wouldn't end well for me, Harold. I'm just here to make sure it doesn't end well for you too. I wasn't bluffing. I didn't need to. Everything was already in motion, and this flash drive was the key to pulling all of it together. If Logan thought he was out of reach, if he thought he was still the one pulling the strings, he was wrong. We had him, had them all cornered now. And it wasn't just me who knew the truth anymore. The second I had received the flash drive, I had already sent it to Marcus, along with everything I could find on Baldwin and Whitaker's shady dealings. Marcus had promised me that he would run it all through their systems and get every name, every link, every piece of damning evidence out in the open. I knew it was only a matter of time before Logan's carefully curated empire came crashing down. Still, a part of me couldn't help but feel a rush of unease. My father's name had been smeared with these files, his legacy forever tainted by the choices he had made, choices I had never known about. And I couldn't ignore the pang in my chest at the thought of him, wondering if he had ever truly wanted out, or if he had been just as complicit as Harold claimed. It was too late for that now, though. I had to focus. Harold seemed to sense the shift in my focus, his eyes flicking down to the flash drive in my hand. The man who had been calm and collected just moments ago now looked like he was trying to find a way out, a lifeline that wasn't going to come. I could almost see him calculating, wondering if he could still salvage something from this, wondering if he could make a deal. You can't take me down like this, he said, his voice a little more desperate now. You don't understand what you're dealing with. I leaned forward slightly, letting the weight of my words sink in. I understand exactly what I'm dealing with, Harold. I just didn't want to believe it. Not at first. But now I get it. You used my father. You used me. You used people's trust for your own gain. And I'm not going to let you walk away from this. Harold looked like he was about to say something else, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I was done playing their game. The truth had a way of coming out, no matter how tightly it was buried. Logan thought he could escape me, but I wasn't letting that happen. The sound of my phone vibrating against my desk made me flinch, breaking the tension in the room. I snatched it up, not bothering to check who was calling. It didn't matter. I already knew what was coming. I picked up the call without saying a word, and Marcus's voice immediately crackled through the speaker. We got everything, Isabel. I swallowed hard, my breath coming in shallow gasps. What do you mean? Everything? All of it. Logan's accounts, his connections, the offshore companies, everything he thought was safe. We've got it all. And we're already working with the feds. You're not alone in this anymore. I leaned back in my chair, the relief crashing over me like a tidal wave. The plan had worked. It wasn't just about getting Logan anymore. It was about bringing the whole damn operation down, exposing every last bit of it. You're sure? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Positive, Marcus said. And don't worry, Logan's not getting away. We've already intercepted his flight. He won't make it to Paris. My heart leapt in my chest. It was over. Logan was done. The FBI had him. I looked back at Harold, who had gone deathly still, his face pale as he processed the words. He wasn't getting away either. He was just another cog in the machine, and I was about to watch it all fall apart. "You can't do this, Isabel," he muttered, his voice small now, defeated. "You don't know what they'll do to you." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The truth had already won. Logan's escape, Harold's lies, the entire world they had built, it was all crumbling. And there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. I picked up the flash drive and walked toward the door. "Have a nice day, Harold," I said with a cold smile. "I'll be seeing you soon." And just like that, I was done. The moment I walked out of Harold's office, my heart was racing, but there was a strange sense of clarity washing over me. I had the drive. I had the names. I had everything I needed to take down the empire Logan had so carefully built around his lies. And yet, despite knowing this, there was a sick feeling gnawing at me, the kind of cold dread you get when you realize you've just stepped into the ring with someone who will do anything to protect themselves. As I made my way down the elevator, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Marcus. I didn't even need to check who it was. I had already known what he was about to say. "Isabel." His voice came through steady, but I could hear the strain underneath. "We've got him." I stopped in my tracks, the world around me narrowing down to just the words on the other end of the line. It was like the air left my lungs for a second, and I had to take a sharp breath to steady myself. "What do you mean, we've got him?" "Logan," Marcus said, his voice low but certain. "He's in custody. He tried to leave the country, but we intercepted his flight. He's on his way back to law as we speak." I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of his words sink in. He was done. The man who had betrayed me, who had spent years weaving a web of lies and deceit, was finally caught. But as I stood there, I couldn't help but wonder, was it really over? Or was this just the beginning? Logan wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and I knew he'd be looking for any way to turn the tables, to make this about me, to make me the villain. I couldn't let my guard down, not now, not when everything was finally falling into place. I shook my head, willing myself to focus. This was about justice. Not just for me, but for the clients whose lives he had ruined, for the people who had been manipulated and left in the dust. I wasn't just taking down Logan, I was taking down the whole system. "Where are you now?" I asked, my voice steely. "I'm at the drop point," Marcus replied. "We're moving him to a secure location before the media catches wind of this. But we've got all the evidence we need to put him away for good. He's not walking free, Isabel." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone Logan had hurt, everyone he had betrayed, everyone who had trusted him. It wasn't just about clearing my name, it was about taking down the corruption at the heart of Baldwin and Whitaker. I started walking again, my steps quickening, purpose flooding back into my body. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The game wasn't over yet. We had Logan, but there was still the matter of what came next, the rest of the people behind the curtain. The ones who had kept him in power for so long. They would be coming for me. They would be coming for Marcus. They'd try to twist the truth, manipulate the evidence, destroy everything we'd fought for. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had spent too long in the shadows, letting people like Logan pull the strings. Now it was my turn. "Keep him locked down, Marcus," the first said firmly. "I'm coming in. We need to get everything we can from him before he has a chance to lawyer up." "You got it," he replied without hesitation. "But be careful. This is far from over. Logan will do anything to save himself. I'm not worried about Logan," I said, my voice cold, my eyes narrowing with resolve. "I'm worried about what's coming next." The elevator doors opened, and I stepped into the lobby, feeling like a completely different person. I wasn't the woman who had blindly trusted her husband. I wasn't the daughter of a man who had been consumed by guilt and fear. I was something else now, stronger, more determined. And no one, not Logan, not Harold, not anyone, was going to stop me from getting the truth out. I made my way out of the building, the familiar surroundings of the city now feeling like a battleground. Every street corner, every shadow, every passing car felt like it held the potential for danger. They were watching. I knew they were. They were going to try to make this about me, about my father. They were going to try to spin it, twist it into something ugly, something that could discredit everything I had worked for. But I wouldn't let them. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my mind racing as I sat behind the wheel. The flash drive burned a hole in my pocket, its presence both a weight and a weapon. I knew what it contained. It wasn't just Logan's downfall. It was the key to exposing everything, every name, every illegal transaction, every person who had turned a blind eye to the truth for far too long. And I was ready to make them pay for it. The phone buzzed again, interrupting my thoughts. I picked it up, seeing Marcus's name flash across the screen. "Isabel, we need to talk," he said quickly, his voice urgent. "Logan's in custody, but he's already trying to play the game. He's threatening to expose your father's involvement in everything. We need to be ready for that." I felt my heart skip a beat. "He's bluffing. He doesn't have anything." "I'm not so sure," Marcus said grimly. "He's got people who know. People who will back him up if he goes public." I gripped the phone tighter, my fingers trembling. "Then we make sure that doesn't happen. We make sure the truth comes out the right way, not the way he wants it to." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then he sighed. "We'll protect your father's legacy, Isabel. But you need to be prepared. He's going to try to make this personal." "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady. But inside, I was preparing for war. This wasn't just about Logan anymore. This was about everything, and I was going to finish it. The fight was far from over. But with Logan in custody, I knew I was closer than I had ever been to putting an end to this nightmare. I could hear the buzz of the city outside as I stared at the flashing red and blue lights through the glass window. Logan was in custody, and I was supposed to feel a sense of victory relief. Maybe, but all I felt was the bitter taste of uncertainty. He was behind bars, yes, but was this really the end of it? No, not by a long shot. I could already feel the weight of what was coming next, the storm that was just beginning to brew. The FBI had him, and it wasn't just Logan I had to worry about anymore. It was everyone else. Everyone who had kept him in power. Everyone who had been complicit in the mess that had shattered my world. I paced back and forth, my phone gripped tightly in my hand as I waited for Marcus to call me back. The night was thick with tension. I couldn't relax, not yet. We had Logan, but that was just one piece of the puzzle. The larger picture still needed to be completed, and there were so many pieces left to uncover. Every name, every account, every person who had benefited from this scheme was still out there, and I was going to bring them down, one by one. I owed it to the people who had been swindled, to my father's memory, to myself. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. When the phone finally buzzed, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I grabbed it immediately, hearing Marcus's voice on the other end. "You're not going to like this," he said, his tone low and tense. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We've got a problem," Marcus said. "Logan's already talking to his lawyer, and he's making threats. He's claiming he's got dirt on your father. He's pushing the idea that your dad was in on the whole thing, that he was part of the scheme, that he was the one who set this whole thing up." I felt the ground shift beneath me. My father, the man I had spent my entire life idolizing, the man whose integrity had been everything to me, Logan was using him against me. He knew exactly how to break me, how to twist the knife. He knew I had spent years wrestling with the idea of my father's involvement, wondering if he had been as complicit as everyone else. But hearing Logan threaten to expose my father like that, expose everything, was more than I could bear. "Is he bluffing?" I asked, my voice tight. I was doing everything I could to keep my emotions in check, but my hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so loudly in my chest. I was afraid Marcus could hear it through the phone. "I don't think so," Marcus said quietly. He's got people on the outside who can back him up. He's already dropped a few names. The board members who were behind everything. He's trying to use them as leverage, trying to flip the narrative. He's already working on his defense strategy. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about my father's legacy, about everything he had built, everything he had worked for, and Logan was trying to destroy it. He was trying to make my father's name just as dirty as his own. Damn it, I muttered under my breath. I knew Logan was a manipulator, but this was below the belt. Listen to me, Isabel, Marcus said, his voice hardening. We can't let him spin this story. We can't let him get away with turning the tables like that. We've got the evidence we need. We just need to make sure it's airtight, make sure no one can refute it. But you need to prepare yourself. Logan is going to fight dirty. He's going to try to twist everything. And if we don't stay ahead of him, he'll do exactly what he's threatening. He'll bury your father's name with him. I felt the bile rise in my throat. My father. The man who had worked in finance his whole life, who had taught me the importance of truth, of doing the right thing. And now Logan was threatening to tear him down, to ruin everything he had stood for. It wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about protecting my father's name, about making sure Logan didn't rewrite history in his favor. I won't let him, I said, my voice cold, every ounce of fear turning into rage. I won't let Logan make my father his scapegoat. Not now. Not ever. Good, Marcus said, his tone firm. We've got everything we need to prove Logan's guilt. The question is, are you ready to go public with it? The weight of his question hung in the air like a lead balloon. Going public, exposing everything. It wasn't just about Logan anymore. It was about making sure this whole corrupt system came crumbling down. It was about using the media, using every tool at our disposal, to make sure that the people who had been hurt by this, my father included, would finally have their voices heard. Yeah, I said, my jaw tightening. I'm ready. Let's do it. We spent the next few hours preparing. I knew that once we released the information, there would be no turning back. Logan would fight it, of course. He'd try to spin the narrative in his favor, but we had the facts. We had the evidence. And we had the truth. As the sun began to set, I felt the final pieces fall into place. I wasn't just fighting for my own vindication anymore. I wasn't just seeking justice for myself, for what Logan had done to me. I was fighting for everyone who had been wronged, for everyone who had placed their trust in Baldwin and Whitaker, for every victim of this scheme who had lost everything. And I wasn't going to stop until they all knew the truth. The world was about to hear Logan's name, but not the way he wanted. He thought he had control. He thought he could run. But the truth had a way of finding its way to the surface, and once it did, there would be no hiding from it. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. The news had already spread like wildfire. Logan's arrest, the charges, the investigation, everything was spilling out into the public eye. And I was standing at the eye of the storm, waiting for the full force of it to hit. For weeks, I had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared me for the weight of what was about to happen. I had taken down Logan, sure, but now I had to take down the whole damn system. The lies, the corruption, the twisted network that had allowed people like him to thrive. It wasn't enough to just expose one man. I needed to rip the entire structure apart. I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment, my reflection staring back at me. It was funny, but when I looked at myself, I didn't see the same woman I had been just a few months ago. I saw someone else entirely, someone stronger, someone who had fought through the hardest battle of her life and had come out the other side, scarred but unbroken. Someone who had stopped running from the truth, no matter how much it hurt, and had started fighting back. I had learned to trust my instincts, to believe in the power of my own voice, and now I was ready to make sure everyone else heard it. The world wasn't going to forget what Logan had done. He thought he could outrun it, but he couldn't. The moment we released the evidence, those files, the bank transfers, The offshore accounts there would be no hiding. The media would feast on it. The FBI would tear through every inch of his operation. And the people who had been complicit in this web of lies, who had known what he was doing and turned a blind eye, they were next. The thing was, Logan had made a huge mistake. He thought he could bury my father with him. He thought that by threatening me, by using my father's name against me, he could force me into submission. But the truth always has a way of coming out, and now it was my turn to make sure the world heard my version of it. My phone buzzed on the counter, cutting through my thoughts. I picked it up, seeing Marcus's name flash on the screen. I answered quickly, not wanting to waste a second. "We've got it," Marcus said, his voice steady but with an edge of excitement I couldn't ignore. "We've got everything." Logan's on his way to be arraigned, and the FBI's already started moving on the rest of the board members. They're not going to get away with this. I felt a knot in my chest loosen just a little. But there was no time to feel relief, not yet. I had seen this before. The way the media would spin it, the way the people involved would lie through their teeth, try to cover up their tracks. But this time, they wouldn't get away with it. I wasn't just the woman who had been wronged. I was the woman who had the truth on her side, and I would make sure the world saw it. "I'm ready," I said, my voice calm, but underneath, there was a fire burning. An unshakable certainty that I had made the right choice. Make sure the press gets what they need. We go public with everything. Marcus paused for a second, then gave a quiet laugh. "It's all yours, Isabel. We've got your back." The weight of his words settled over me, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. But it was quickly pushed aside by a wave of confidence. I wasn't alone in this. I had the FBI. I had Marcus. I had the truth. And for once, that was enough. I grabbed my coat and left the apartment, stepping into the cool evening air. It was one of those nights in the city where the lights seemed brighter, the streets louder. A part of me was terrified of the fallout, terrified of what people would say about me, about my father. But I couldn't let fear control me anymore. I couldn't let it stop me from doing what I knew was right. The drive to the courthouse felt like it lasted a lifetime, the anticipation growing with each passing minute. By the time I stepped out of the car and walked toward the steps of the building, the press was already there, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions I couldn't even hear over the noise. I knew what they were after. They wanted the scandal. They wanted the dirt. They wanted the drama. But they were going to get something far more powerful than a juicy headline. I walked past them without a glance, my focus on the door ahead. I wasn't going to let them control this narrative. Not anymore. Inside, I could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the buzz of the courtroom as people filed in, their voices carrying a weight of anticipation. I took my seat, my hands clammy, my heart racing in my chest. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The moment I had been fighting for. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Logan sat across from me, his eyes locked on mine for a split second, his smug smirk faltering just enough to let me know he knew his fate was sealed. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that he could play the system, that he could use me as his shield. But I wasn't his shield anymore. I was his reckoning. The prosecutor began laying out the charges: fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. The list went on, each one a dagger through the heart of Logan's carefully crafted empire. But it wasn't just Logan on trial. The entire operation was exposed now. The people who had been complicit in his crimes, who had turned a blind eye, who had protected him because they thought they could get away with it, they were all part of this. And as the evidence was read aloud, the media snapped pictures, the air thick with tension as the truth spread. Then came the moment I had been dreading and anticipating all at once. My father's name was brought up. The mention of his involvement sent a ripple through the room. Logan had tried to twist the truth, tried to frame him as the mastermind behind it all. But the truth was out now. The truth was that my father had been a victim, just like everyone else who had been swept into this mess. The truth was, that he had tried to expose the corruption, had tried to protect the company from itself. And now it was up to me to make sure that his name was cleared. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked to the front of the courtroom. The weight of everything was on me: my father's legacy, my own redemption, the future of Baldwin and Whitaker. But as I stood there looking at Logan's face, I knew what I had to do. I had already won. The truth had already won. And no one, not Logan, not Harold, not anyone could take that away from me. "I'm here to set the record straight," I said, my voice clear, my words ringing out across the courtroom. My father wasn't part of this. He was the one who tried to stop it. And now it's time for the world to know the truth. As I spoke, I saw the faces of the people in the room shift, some with surprise, some with guilt. They knew what was coming. They knew they couldn't hide anymore. When the judge gave the final verdict, I didn't feel relief, or triumph, or even victory. What I felt was something deeper, something quieter. Justice had been served, and I had finally found my place in it. You might think it's over, but trust me, the real shock is just about to unfold. I thought I had won, but that was nothing compared to the truth that was about to explode in my face. The last thing I ever expected was this, but it didn't just end there. If you think you know what happens next, think again. What if I told you that the biggest betrayal was yet to come? Do you think I made the right choice, or did I make a huge mistake? Drop your thoughts below and let me know what you would have done in my shoes. This is the moment everything changes. The truth always comes to light eventually. I learned the hard way that you can't ignore the red flags, even when it's easier to turn a blind eye. I spent years believing in lies, but when I finally stopped running from the truth, everything changed. No matter how powerful someone seems, they can't escape the consequences forever. Don't let anyone manipulate your reality or use your fear against you. Stand up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. The system might be rigged, but your voice, your truth can break it wide open. We all deserve justice, and we have to fight for it.